Planted in the Word, week 37, and specifically today we're going to talk about days 6 and 7 and the reading you've done there, which is really between Daniel 4 and I think Daniel 9. And we're going to talk about the impact that had mostly in the times after this, because these are very prophetic passages. Now, Daniel was probably written about 540, somewhere between 540 and 530 BC. Daniel 2 is the dream that Nebuchadnezzar has that Daniel interprets, and it talks about the influences of the nations that were going to rule the world. And Daniel gives that interpretation that we start out with the gold head of the Babylonian Empire and we work our way down through the Medo-Persian culture, through the Greek culture, through the Roman culture, and we see the progression of these countries that are going to rule the world. Today I would like to talk to you a little bit about the Greek culture and what we call Hellenism, or the Hellenization of the world, and how that came to be. You read about the goat, and the goat being the interpretation that it was Greece. And the fact that the goat runs across the field at a great speed lets us know and reiterates the conquering of Alexander the Great and how quickly that happened. I want to talk a little bit about what Alexander the Great did, what he brought in. Well, he brought in that Hellenism. And to understand Hellenism, we have to understand what was going on culturally. Well, what is Hellenism? Hellenism was essentially the first time in history that the religious focus changed from the gods-centric to human-centric. And that was a huge shift. Protagoras said, ultimately, his quote is, "Man is the measure of all things." And that is Hellenism in a nutshell. The focus came off of deities as the center of life, and man himself became the center of life. So Hellenism brought in a couple of different philosophies. The two we'll talk about are Stoicism and Epicureanism, and those two are on different ends of the spectrum. Stoicism said the most important thing is knowledge and reason and logic, and these are the things that are to be pursued. Where Epicureanism said, listen, the most important thing in life, the biggest goal you should have is pleasure. So you can see how those two ideas and philosophies were on opposite ends of the spectrum. The interesting thing about Alexander the Great is he conquered the known world. He didn't demand that everybody continue or begin to follow Greek philosophies. What he did is he allowed Hellenism to coexist alongside the cultures that he conquered. In essence, he allowed this duality to exist. But the duality was heavily weighted toward Hellenism, because where the cultures of the pre-existing eras were all about worship and sacrifice, Hellenism really became about enjoyment and pleasure. They were focused on things like gymnasium, where men would go to learn how to execute war and battle and train the body. It focused on theater, where there was entertainment and pleasure. It focused on mythology, where mythology was really more about a moral compass and learning things culturally than it really began to be less about a focus on religion. When we have this shift over from the previous generations now to this Hellenistic culture, we find that Hellenism really began in like 320 BC and carried all the way through about 31 BC. Now, it isn't a hard break. What began to happen as the Greek culture began to decrease, as the Roman culture began to increase. And those two things were very similar. The pagan gods of the Greeks became new names, but basically very recognizable as the gods of the Roman culture, and a lot of the philosophies hung around and were the same. Now, why would I bother to spend time talking about this? Well, I think that it's helpful to understand as we transition from our Old Testament to our New Testament that all these things had a great impact on the world that Christ was born into. In fact, these cultural changes were the ones that brought about the Sadducees, the Pharisees, the Essenes, this Herodian empire that began to rise in power. And all of these factions were becoming a very significant players in the world that Christ was born into. And when we understand that, we go into our New Testament with understanding maybe for the dynamics that's going on in the background, more than just trying to keep our world history and our biblical understanding separate. I hope you find that interesting. If you'd like to look more into that, look and study the period between the Testaments. You will find that there's a lot of great information that will help you understand moving forward the dynamics that are going on. Have a great day. See you next time. Bye-bye.